Let me tell you about a quiet widower who bought 14 acres of soaking wet shade on the north face of a hollow above the Rogue River in Curry County, Oregon, and what I watched him do with it from my side of the creek over the 6 years that followed. My name is not the part that matters. What matters is that my little bramble patch and 2 beehives sat just across Copper Creek from his ground, close enough that from my back sunroom I could see the whole shaded fall of that hillside through the alders, and far enough that for a long while I could not make sense of one single thing he was doing over there. The morning he walked the first row of stakes onto that ground, I was standing at the back of my woodshed with a cup of black coffee watching the mist come up slow and gray off the water. It was the 3rd week of March 2005, a Wednesday. The kind of raw wet, cool the southern Oregon coast gives you in early spring, where the air holds the salt of the ocean 4 miles off, but the sun does not warm anything before 10 in the morning. He was over there on the steep north tilt of his land, with what looked from 100 yards off like a short-handled steel pick, and a coil of white nylon cord looped over his shoulder, setting stakes into ground that had not grown anything but sword fern and rotting hemlock stumps since the last big cut came through in 1979. That parcel had a name, and the name was not a kind one. Folks around Gold Beach called it the Wet Scar. It was just dead. 14 acres of steep north face timber land the loggers had walked off of because the ground was so full of seep and spring water, a skidder would sink to the axle by 10 in the morning. A blueberry outfit had tried it in the mid-90s, and the roots had drowned inside 2 seasons. A younger fellow had tried shiitake mushroom logs after that, and the air was so damp and still the logs went black with contamination inside a year. The county sold it at auction the first Tuesday of March that year for less than the price of a used trailer hitch. Nobody bid against the widower. The little clerk's office had gone quiet when he raised his card. They let him have it the way a room lets a stranger have a thing nobody wants. His name, I would come to learn, was Silas Renner. He was 61 years old that spring, lean and stooped in the shoulders with pale sand-colored hair gone half to gray, cut plain and short, and a long, weathered face that had spent 34 years standing in front of a chalkboard at the Port Orford High School teaching biology. He had lost his only son in a logging truck accident on Highway 101 back in the fall of 1998. He had lost his wife Marta to complications from diabetes in December of 2003. He had taken early retirement the following June and sold their small clapboard house in town. And by the following March, he had spent a piece of that money on the one parcel in the whole Rogue River Basin that everybody knew for a fact was finished. Meredith Kelso, my wife of 42 years, called me in from the woodshed that evening. Merle Bickerstaff had stopped by. Merle ran a big cranberry bog on the flats south of Bandon and a 200-head dairy above it. And he had driven the back road past Silas's land around 4, while the widower was still out in the cold rain. He did not say much. He said he had seen the new fellow on the Wet Scar with a strange steel pick in his hands and had tried to think of a charitable way to say what he was thinking and decided there wasn't one. I asked him what he was thinking. Then he said, "Elwood, that poor man is going to bury himself on ground that has not come back and never will. Somebody sold him a story. I told him I did not know yet. He said, 'Well, I do,' and we let it sit there. But I had watched Silas that morning, and there was something in the way he moved that Merle's kitchen visit could not account for. He had been out there before first light. I know because I am up before first light most days myself. An old habit 41 years of running the county water district puts in your bones. When I came out to the shed at a little past 5:30, his old crew cab pickup was already pulled off on the shoulder of the gravel road, and I could see the small white cone of a headlamp moving slow across the long-shaded fall of his ground in the gray dark. Not searching, not wandering, moving in a steady line from one contour to the next, then stepping down maybe 18 inches and beginning again. Like he had already laid the whole face of that hollow out in his head before he ever set foot on it. He worked through the morning and into the cold of the afternoon. By 11, the temperature had crept up only to about 44, which is what a north-facing slope on the Oregon coast does to you straight through April. He did not stop. He had a steel thermos staged on the tailgate, and he came down to it maybe once every 2 hours. Drank standing up and went back. He did not eat that I saw. He did not sit down. He pounded a steak, tied off the cord with a small, careful knot, sighted down the line, and moved on. A few feet, another steak. I watched him a long while before I went on with my own rounds, and I could not place what bothered me about it. At 68 years old, I have watched a lot of folks work a lot of bad ground on this coast, and you learn to tell the difference between a person trying a thing and a person executing one. Silas was executing. He worked until the light went thin and blue around 6:30 in the evening. Then he coiled his cord and drove away. I stood at the corner of my alder windbreak with the last of my coffee gone cold and looked at his ground. From the road you could see nothing he had done, but that is not what this story is about. That is only what the land looked like from the road, from Merle Bickerstaff's truck. From any place a person did not trouble himself to look closely. What I had watched that day was a quiet man doing a thing on purpose, with the kind of unhurried certainty you do not come by without paying for it first. A brief note for the viewer. The tool Silas was using that morning is called a mattock, a short-handled steel pick with a flat blade on one end for cutting roots, and a heavy point on the other for breaking hard or stony ground. It is one of the oldest hand tools still in daily use in American agriculture, going back to colonial times, and its design has barely changed because on a steep, wet hillside where a shovel will not bite and a rototiller will not stand, it remains the most effective tool a person can carry to break ground by hand. Part 2. Now, here's the part of it that the whole Rogue River Basin got wrong, and got wrong loudly. About 6 days into his staking, I had a reason to walk down to the footbridge that spans Copper Creek at the low corner of our two properties. A cedar plank had rotted through the winter, and I meant to replace it before the salmon run brought the boys down to fish the pools. I took my crowbar and a fresh plank and walked the quarter-mile through the ferns and salal to the water. I did not go down to introduce myself, but the bridge needed working, and it sat right at the foot of where he was staking his lower rows. He heard me coming a good 40 feet off. He straightened up from the stake he was working and looked at me without any surprise, the way a person looks at a thing they have already accounted for. I said good morning. He said it back. His voice was lower than I expected, steady, with a faint, precise clip to it. 34 years of talking to teenagers about cell walls had put a teacher's careful edge on him that a life of quiet had not worn out. I told him I was his neighbor across the creek. He said he knew. I nodded at the stakes and asked him, plain as I could, what he was planting. He said wasabi. I did not at that moment know what to do with that. I knew wasabi the way every man who has eaten grocery store sushi knows it. The sharp green paste in the plastic packet. I had a vague idea it came from a plant, and a vague idea the plant grew somewhere in Japan. I told him I had never heard of a person planting it on purpose in Oregon, that the whole country's wasabi was flown in from Japan, or squeezed out of a tube of horseradish and food coloring, and that no grower on the southern Oregon coast had ever tried it commercial. He nodded slow, the way you nod at a person who has said something polite and expected. Then he asked me a question I have not forgotten. He asked me what I thought the limiting factor would be on that ground for wasabi in this country. I said the cold, probably, and the shade, and the way that whole face never dried out even in August, and the way the spring seeped out year-round so a person could not put a proper crop road through it. He shook his head just barely. He said the cold was the asset, the shade was the asset, the year-round seep was the asset. Wasabi did not want warm ground and open sun. Warm, dry air would burn the leaves and shrivel the rhizome and kill the plant inside a single summer. It wanted exactly what that hillside was. Cold running water at a steady 48 degrees, deep shade, gravel-choked soil, and a slope steep enough that water moved past the roots instead of standing on them. He said that was the ground the plant grew on for 1,000 years in the mountain valleys of the Izu Peninsula and Shizuoka Prefecture in Japan, where the true wasabi is native and farmers had cultivated it in stone-walled water channels for centuries before any American tasted a fresh grated root. He said wasabi was not a paste. It was a rhizome, a thick green root that grew slow, 3 years to a mature crop, at the edge of a running stream in the deep shade of a wooded canyon. It needed cold water above all else. Clean, cold moving water, broken shade, rough stone. He said the thing everybody saw as wrong with that hillside was the very thing that made it perfect. Every other man in the basin had looked at the wet scar and seen what would not grow. He had come looking for ground that would grow the one thing he was after, and there was not a better 14 acres for it on the coast. I picked up my crowbar. We talked a few minutes more about the footbridge, which he offered to help me replank the following Saturday, and which he did, better than I could have alone. I walked back up to my place with a feeling I did not have a word for yet. I told you there is a difference between a person trying a thing and a person finishing one. Standing at that bridge, I understood I had been wrong about that too. Silas was not trying to figure out that hillside. He had figured it out long before he ever raised his card. What I was watching was not a question. It was an answer being completed. Merle Bickerstaff came up my drive that same afternoon. He had brought Meredith a bucket of cull cranberries to put up as jelly, and he stood on my porch and looked west across the creek toward the wet scar where Silas was working the 11th or 12th stake row. He said, "Elwood, what in the world is that man doing over there?" I told him. "Planting wasabi." He looked at me. "Wasabi?" I said yes. "On the wet scar?" I said yes. He stood there a long minute. Then he said the thing the whole valley was already saying in private, that somebody had taken advantage of a broken-down widower who had come off a bad season of grief, that the wet scar had whipped every grower who ever touched it, and would whip this one too, that you could no more farm that hillside than the bottom of Copper Creek itself. He did not say it with meanness. He said it the way men in this country say a hard thing when they think it needs saying out loud. And I did not argue because the history of that parcel was as bad as Merle said. But I had stood 40 feet from Silas Renner at the water and heard him say the word wasabi the way a man says the name of something he has known and studied for a very long time. I watched the hillside a while after Merle drove off. Silas had moved to the next row, sighting, driving, tying, moving on. Then he stopped and pulled something from the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and stood up straight a moment to look at it. It was a small notebook, the black cloth-covered kind they sell at the feed store for $4. The way he handled it told me it was not new. He opened it to one particular page without hunting for it, read something, closed it, and put it back. He did not write anything down. He was checking the hillside against work he had already done somewhere else, before he ever turned the first spadeful of gravel on the ground. That notebook bothered me more than I let on, the way a thing bothers you when you half recognize it but cannot place it. Whatever was guiding Silas Renner across that dead hillside, he had not thought of it that year. He was finishing work already finished in his head, written in a hand I would later learn was not even his own. And that, I came to understand, made all the difference in the world. A brief note for the viewer. True wasabi, known to botanists as Wasabia japonica, is not a horseradish and not a mustard, though a distant cousin of both. It is a slow-growing semi-aquatic plant, native to the mountain stream valleys of central and southern Japan, where it has been cultivated for 600 years, in a specialized method called sawa cultivation, meaning stream-grown. The mature rhizome takes 2 to 3 years to reach market size and must be freshly grated at the moment of use because its flavor breaks down within 15 minutes. Almost all the wasabi sold in American grocery stores is not wasabi at all, but a paste of horseradish, mustard powder, and green food coloring. Part 3. Now, here is the part of the story I want you to stay with, because this is where I learned what Silas Renner had really been doing, and where I understood that what looked from the county road like one widower's foolishness was the most carefully reasoned piece of work I ever saw done on a parcel of Oregon coastal ground. It was about 12 days after he finished his staking. I had walked down to the footbridge one evening with a small jar of Meredith's fireweed honey. Silas was sitting on a flat mossy rock at the foot of his stake rows with an enamel cup of black tea. I held up the jar over the creek. He came across on the plank we had replaced. We talked a minute, and then he asked me if I wanted to come up to the house. I said I would. His house was a small board and batten place a quarter mile up the shoulder of the hollow. 2 rooms and a covered porch. The caretaker's cabin for the old timber operation in 1956, and sat empty 11 years before he bought it with the land. We sat on the front porch in 2 old fur armchairs facing north toward the dark hemlocks across the ridge. The light was going that deep silver the coast gives you in early April at 7 in the evening. He set a notebook on the crate table between us, not the field book from his shirt pocket. A hardbound ledger with a cloth cover gone soft and brown at the corners, carried in a satchel for years, and rained on more than once. He opened it slow. The pages were old, a heavy cream paper gone tea brown at the edges, and everyone was crowded with a fine slanted hand that was not his own. Dates in the margins, columns of figures, water temperature readings in Fahrenheit and Celsius both, pencil drawings of rhizomes and how they set their fine white roots into a gravel bed. Some notations were in English, some in careful vertical Japanese characters. Tucked into the inside cover were photocopies gone waxy with old toner. He laid one flat for me. It was a page of a field report from the fall of 1968. The header read, Kenji Fukazawa, Private Field Notes, Josephine County and Curry County, Oregon. The report was about the sawa cultivation of Wasabi japonica on the small Cold Spring creeks of the southern Oregon Coast Range. Silas said the name out loud, the way you say a name you have been thinking about for years. Fukazawa had come to America in 1948 from a mountain village in Shizuoka Prefecture, where his family had grown wasabi in a stone-walled sawa channel for 4 generations. He settled first in the Hood River Valley and in the late 50s moved south to work as a nursery hand outside Grants Pass. Fukazawa had never spoken publicly about wasabi. He never applied for a permit, never advertised. But on weekends and vacations for almost 20 years, he had driven the back roads of the Coast Range in an old Ford station wagon with a soil auger and a stream thermometer in the trunk. He walked into the Cold Spring creeks of Curry, Josephine, and Coos counties and did what no other grower had thought to do. He measured them. Water temperature, gravel size, shade percentage, flow rate, sulfur and iron content. He had been looking for the American equivalent of the mountain streams of his childhood home. He had found several. The best of them, he had written, was a north-facing seep hollow on the west shoulder of the Rogue River drainage above Gold Beach, Copper Creek, the very ground Silas Renner bought at auction 37 years later. Fukazawa had grown small experimental plots of wasabi in 4 locations on that hollow between 1962 and 1978. He grew them without permission on land that was not his, in plots of 80 or 90 plants at a time, in gravel channels he built by hand and dismantled after each 3-year harvest so no one would see. He recorded every one. His yields matched or exceeded the yields his father and grandfather had recorded in the family sawa in Japan. His rhizomes, tested at Oregon State on samples he mailed anonymously, came in at a concentration higher than any imported Japanese sample the lab had on file. He never sold a single root. Fukazawa retired in 1982 and moved to a care home in Grants Pass. He died there in the spring of 1989, quietly, without ever having published a word of his work. His notebooks, 6 of them, sat in the nightstand beside his bed for 12 years. His only daughter, Yuriko, was a woman Silas had taught in his 10th grade biology class at Port Orford in 1978. She had gone on to become a veterinarian in Coos Bay. In 2001, she cleaned out her father's last effects and recognized what she was holding. She drove down the coast to Silas's classroom on a Saturday and put the box on his desk. She said her father had always spoken of the one teacher who had asked her, at 14, real questions about her grandfather's farm. Silas had sat with those notebooks, he told me, for the better part of 4 years before he planted a single crown. The first winter he used them to learn to read the Japanese. He sat at his kitchen table with a dictionary Yuriko had loaned him, and went character by character across 3 of the notebooks until he could follow Fukazawa's shorthand. The second and third winters he walked. He walked every seep creek Fukazawa had marked in every season, comparing his own numbers against Fukazawa's across 40 years. Everything matched. The 4th winter, after Marta passed, he stopped measuring. He had been waiting until he was sure the conclusion was the right one and not just the one he needed. I told him my own father had done a thing like that once. Walked a piece of orchard ground on our old place above Powers 3 summers before he set the first apple whip on it. The neighbors thought he was waiting on money. He wasn't. He was waiting on certainty, which is a different thing and costs more. Silas nodded the way you nod when a man says something plain and true. I asked him one more thing that evening, how he could have been so sure that what he found on his hillside would match what a dead man had written 3 decades before. He said he had not been sure. You cannot be sure of a thing like that. What you can be is prepared to be wrong about it in a small enough way that you can recover. 400 wasabi crowns, he said, was the size of a mistake he could afford. If the hillside was not what he believed it to be, he would lose 3 years and the cost of the crowns, and walk away knowing more about that ground than any living man on the coast. That was the deal he had made with himself alone in that dark cabin, with the March rain coming down on the metal roof. It was the deal he honored the morning he drove the first stake. A brief note for the viewer. Across the 20th century, a great deal of careful private agricultural research was carried out in the United States by immigrant growers who never held university positions and never sought publication. Japanese American, Portuguese American, and Italian American farmers in the western states carried methods and cultivars and family knowledge and personal notebooks, much of it never written down in English, and much of it lost when the elder generation passed. Where those notebooks survived, and a patient reader who could bridge the language and the soil came along, they sometimes preserved practical field knowledge no university station had ever matched. Part 4. The Wasabi did almost nothing for the first year and a half, the way Silas had told me to expect. From my sunroom, the hillside looked the same as it had the day he finished planting. The gravel-lined channels dark and wet under the alders. The small green crowns so low and pale against the wet stone that you could not see them from the county road even in full leaf. The community mostly forgot about him. Merle Bickerstaff still shook his head when he drove past the wet scar on his way south to Bandon. But Silas walked that hillside every morning at first light, in the cold and in the mist, checking the flow rate of each of the 11 small stream channels he had cut across the face of the hollow, pulling by hand the wild bracken and salal shoots that came up between the crowns, adjusting the little cedar slat weirs he had built to keep the water moving at exactly the pace the Sawa method required. He wrote in his own small, even hand in a second field book he kept for the purpose. In the second year, you could see them. In the third year, the dead hillside that had grown nothing but sword fern in living memory was thick with row on row of broad heart-shaped wasabi leaves rising a full 16 inches above the moving water. The crowns beneath them swelling slowly into the thick green rhizomes the Japanese have valued for 600 years. I stood at my end of the footbridge and looked at it a long time. Meredith came down one Sunday afternoon and said, "Elwood, that man is not the man I thought he was." I told her none of us had been. But wasabi does not pay in the second year. Wasabi makes you wait, and Silas waited. He had planted for the mature rhizome, the 2.5-year root, the kind you grate fresh at the moment of use, and that would not be ready until the harvest of the third year. He spent that time carefully. He thinned the weaker crowns. He divided the strongest ones and set the offsets in new channels he cut lower down the hollow under the same broken canopy of alder and vine maple. So his original 400 crowns slowly became 800, then closer to 1,000. He kept his notebook. He kept Fukazawa's ledger on the kitchen table where he could reach it. It was in the third year that the thing turned, and it turned the way these things do, slow. And then all at once, Silas harvested his first mature rhizomes that spring. He pulled them by hand at the moment Fukazawa had specified, when the outer skin just begins to show a faint pale blush at the base. And he washed them in the running water of Copper Creek itself and dried them on cedar racks in the cool of his covered porch overnight. He grated a small piece off the end of the first one on the little sharkskin grater Yuriko had sent him from her father's own kitchen to see what 3 years of that hillside had made. The paste that came up off the grater was pale spring green and fine as whipped cream, and the scent that lifted out of it was so clean and sharp it filled the porch and drifted out into the dooryard where I could smell it standing at the footbridge. It was not the flat sinus burn of the tube. It was a bright, complex green sweetness with a slow rising heat behind it that faded almost as fast as it came. He sent a single fresh rhizome packed on ice to a food science lab at Oregon State University in Corvallis because he wanted to know what he had. The technician from the lab called him on the telephone before the written report ever reached the mailbox. The isothiocyanate concentration of Silas's rhizomes, grown on that steep, wet north face of a hollow above Copper Creek, was the highest the lab had ever measured from a North American sample. Higher, she said, than any of the imported fresh Japanese samples they had on file. She asked Silas where they had been grown. Silas told her, an old cut-over hollow outside Gold Beach the timber people wouldn't touch. She asked if it could be done again. Silas said it could. The first one to drive out was a young chef who ran a small omakase counter in the Pearl District up in Portland. He had heard about Silas's roots from the lab. He drove the 4.5 hours south down the coast highway and stood on Silas's porch and grated a piece off a fresh rhizome with his own sharkskin plate, and breathed in slow and stood a long moment without saying a word. What he said when he finally spoke was not how much does it cost. It was how many can I have? Then came a chef who drove down from Seattle, then 2 more from San Francisco, then a chef from a small kaiseki restaurant in Vancouver, British Columbia, who had read about Silas's roots in a Pacific Northwest food journal and drove 11 hours to see the hollow. They drove hours, all of them, past 1,000 well-watered farms to buy off the one hillside every grower on the southern Oregon coast had sworn was finished. Silas did not raise his prices. He did not expand past what one man could tend and pull and pack with care. He sold his rhizomes to a short list of small restaurants in 5 states and 1 Canadian province. And the waiting list ran longer every season, and he never once put a sign out on the county road. The folks who had laughed at the auction did not laugh anymore. Some of them came around hat in hand to ask how he had done it. Merle Bickerstaff drove up one Saturday morning in the middle of the 4th harvest year and stood on the porch and did not sit down. Silas told him plainly, the way he told everybody who asked, because the telling was part of the work too. He told him about Kenji Fukazawa and the 6 notebooks in the nightstand at the care home in Grants Pass, and the daughter who had brought them to a 10th grade biology teacher because her father had once mentioned him kindly at supper. He never once let a person believe he had done it alone. He is older now. The sand-colored hair has gone almost fully to white. He still walks the hollow every morning at first light. He still uses the same mattock he started with, the wooden handle worn dark and smooth by his palms. He has had the brittle pages of Fukazawa's ledger copied and bound in 3 volumes and keeps the originals in a small cedar box on his kitchen table under a piece of muslin. And on the kitchen windowsill above his sink, where the late afternoon sun comes through, there is a single glass jar. It is small, no bigger than a pint canning jar, and it is half full of smooth dark gravel scraped by hand out of Copper Creek the first afternoon he owned the land, before he drove a single stake. On the front, in his own hand, in black marker, is a small label. It reads, Copper Creek Gravel, Curry County, Oregon, March 2005. He showed it to me once. I asked him why a man would keep a jar of the very creek gravel everybody had told him was worthless. He turned it in the light a while. Then he said the water was never the problem. The water was the whole reason. It was the cold, moving spring water that made the rhizome. And it was that same cold water. The wet ground, the year-round shade, the steep face that would not take a tractor, that scared every other grower off the parcel and left it cheap enough for a widower to buy. Everybody looked at this hillside, he said, and saw what would not grow. One dead man looked at the same hillside and saw what would. He set the jar back on the sill. The land doesn't owe you a crop. It owes you the truth of what was always there, if you're willing to wait and pay enough to see it. A brief note for the viewer. The cultivation of true Wasabi japonica has begun in recent years to take quiet root in the cold spring hollows of the Pacific Northwest, particularly in coastal Oregon and coastal Washington, and in small operations on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Growers have found that the region's cold, clear, spring-fed creeks, long considered too wet and too shaded for conventional row crops, produce fresh rhizomes of unusually high pungency and complexity, well suited to high-end culinary use. The model favors patient, small-scale operations on marginal shaded land and has drawn quiet interest from second-career growers and restaurants across the American West.